Good morning. We invite you to settle in while Sean gifts us with some prelude music, and then we will sing together. Sean, invite us to settle in with some prelude. We invite you now to rise in body or in spirit and join in singing together, Gather the Spirit. For those who want the hymnal in front of them, it's number 347. I have a favorite, this is a favorite hymn of mine. I've brought it here many times, and you've probably heard the story as part of why that is, and Merlin would remember this. Jim Scott, the songwriter, used to be part of the Eugene congregation. And Merlin and I got to sing this with Jim a few times. So, gather the Spirit, harvest the power.
Gather the Spirit, harvest the power. Our separate fires will kindle one flame. Witness the mystery of this hour. Our trials in this life appear all the same. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit of heart and mind. Seeds for the sowing are laid in store. Nurtured in love, conscious refined, with body and spirit united once more. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit growing in all, drawn by the moon and fed by the sun. Winter to spring, summer to fall, the chorus of life resounding as one. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again.
Good morning. Welcome. Lily was unable to be with us today, so Larry High and I are filling in. I welcome all of you today. I especially welcome those of you who are here for the first time. I invite everyone to stay for coffee and conversation after the service. Also, there's a board meeting for those who might be interested in attending. Church announcements are in your order of service. And I don't think there's any other announcements unless somebody raises a hand and tells me there are. Okay. Now is the time that we collect food and money for the Fish Food Pantry. This is a combined area of Roseburg area churches. Your gifts are gratefully received and will be put to good use.
Thank you for your generosity. We now, as is the tradition of Unitarian Universalism, settle into a time of shared worship with the lighting of our chalice. The words are from Jalal al-Din Rumi. Don't worry about saving these songs. And if one of our instruments breaks, it doesn't matter. We have fallen into the place where everything is music. The strumming and the flute notes rise into the atmosphere, and even if the whole world's harps should burn up, there will still be hidden instruments playing. So the candle flickers and goes out. We have a piece of flint and a spark. In such a spirit of ongoing renewal, we rekindle our chalice flame. And I have a story to share, and I remind people regularly that I consider them stories for all ages. It's, partially the old preschool teacher in me, but it's also, I'm going to talk a little bit about theology today, and it's a little bit heady, but I want to acknowledge one of my favorite theologians is the illustrator, author, Leo Leoni, so I want to share one of his stories with all of you. And it's tied to what I'm going to preach about in a more formal sermon. It's titled, Alexander and the Wind-Up Mouse. You may have heard it here before, but we sing the same hymn, so once in a while I could bring back a story too, right? Help, help, a mouse. There was a scream, then a crash. Cups, saucers, and spoons were flying in all directions. Alexander ran for his hole as fast as his little legs could carry him. All he wanted was a few crumbs, and yet every time they saw him, they would scream for help and chase him with a broom. One day, when there was no one in the house, Alexander heard a squeak in Annie's room. He sneaked in, and what did he see? Another mouse. But not an ordinary mouse like himself. Instead of legs, it had two little wheels, and on its back there was a key. Who are you? Asked Alexander. I'm Willie, the wind-up mouse, Annie's favorite toy. They wind me up, make me run around in circles. They cuddle me, and at night I sleep on a soft white pillow between the doll and a woolly teddy bear. Everyone loves me. They don't care much for me, said Alexander sadly, and he was happy to have found a friend. Let's go to the kitchen and look for crumbs, he said. I can't, said Willie. I can only move when they wind me, but I don't mind. Everybody loves me. So there's the two of them together. Alexander, too, came to love Willie. He went to visit him whenever he could. He told him of his adventures with brooms, flying saucers, and mouse traps. I mean, we're talking flying saucers, not flying saucers. Willie talked about the penguin, the woolly bear, and mostly about Annie. The two friends spent many happy hours together. But when he was alone in the dark in his hideout, Alexander thought of Willie with envy. Ah, he sighed. Why can't I be a wind-up mouse like Willie and be cuddled and loved? One day, Willie told a strange story. I've heard, he whispered mysteriously, that in the garden at the end of the pebble path, close to the blackberry bush, there lives a magic lizard who can change one animal to another. Do you mean, said Alexander, that he could change me into a wind-up mouse like you? That very afternoon, Alexander went into the garden and ran to the end of the path. Lizard, lizard, he whispered, and suddenly there stood before him, full of the colors of flowers and butterflies, a large lizard. Is it true that you could change me into a wind-up mouse? Asked Alexander. When the moon is round, said the lizard, bring me a purple pebble. For days and days, Alexander searched the garden for a purple pebble in vain. He found yellow pebbles and blue pebbles and green pebbles, but not one tiny purple pebble. At last, tired and hungry, he returned to the house. In a corner of the pantry, he saw a box full of old toys, and there between the blocks and broken dolls was Willie. What happened? Said Alexander, surprised. Willie told him a sad story. It had been Annie's birthday, and there had been a party, and everyone had brought a gift. The next day, Willie sighed, many of the old toys were dumped in this box. We will all be thrown away. Alexander was almost in tears. Poor Willie, he thought. But then suddenly something caught in his eye. Could it really be? Yes, it was. It was a little purple pebble. All excited, he ran to the garden, the precious pebble tight in his arms. There was a full moon. Out of breath, Alexander stopped near the blackberry bush. Lizard, lizard, in the bush, he called quickly. There's the purple pebble on the edge of the box, in case you missed it from out there. The leaves rustled, and there stood the lizard. The moon is round, the pebble found, said the lizard. Who or what do you want to be? I want to be, Alexander stopped. Then suddenly he said, Lizard, lizard, could you change Willie into a mouse like me? The lizard blinked. There was a blinding light, and then all of a sudden, quiet. The purple pebble was gone. Alexander ran back to the house as fast as he could. The box was there, but alas, it was empty. Too late, he thought, and with a heavy heart, he went to his hole in the baseboard. Something squeaked. Cautiously, Alexander moved closer to the hole. There was a mouse inside. Who are you? Said Alexander, a little frightened. My name is Willie, said the mouse. Willie, cried Alexander. The lizard did it. And he hugged Willie, and they ran to the garden path, and they danced and danced until dawn. Who or what do you want to be? Kathy.
Now's the time in our service when we share joys and concerns with silent or spoken candle lighting. Those of you who have a joy or concern to share, please form a line to my right. And if you have a spoken candle, please give your name and please be brief. The offering is a sacrament of the Free Church. We are supported by the voluntary generosity of all who attend. For the gifts we have received, we are truly grateful. Your gifts will be put to good use.
So if we can sing the same, if we can hear the same story before, again, there are some things that bear repeating, and this anthem you've heard before, but it's, I gather it's very much in tune with the message we're going to hear about more. Be the change. Got to be the change you wanna see in this world. If you wanna see a change, you got to rearrange your own world. In this world, we are the agents of change. In this world, could be a source of peace and harmony. In this world, we could be an angel of change. You can curse the night, or you can shine a light in this world. The way you live your life can be a ray of light in this world. In this world, we are the agents of change. In this world, could be a source of peace and harmony. In this world, we could be an angel of change. If your life's in tune with what you know is true in this world, When you speak the truth will speak through you to this world. In this world, we are the agents of change. In this world, we could be a source of peace and harmony. In this world, we could be an angel of change. Whatever we've done, wherever we are, we can choose to change. We can make a new start. We can all make a difference. We can all play a part. There's a wave of change coming heart to heart. In this world, we could be an angel of change. You've got to be the change you want to see in this world. If you want to see a change, you've got to rearrange your own world. In this world, I'm agent of change. In this world, we could be a source of peace and harmony. In this world, we could be an angel of change.
Thank you, Sean and Susie. Change. Change begins with imagination. Change begins with non-action. And imagination needs space and time to grow. In that spirit, I invite you into a time of quiet breathing together, imagining, if you will, together. In silent time, often thoughts come in. Meditation practices encourage us to let them flow through. Well, if what comes to mind to you in time of silence is a to-do list, I urge you to let it go and let it flow through. But what if emerges for you is imagining something beautiful and wonderful? Sit with that. Be present in this moment with what can be. a cleansing breath in and out. Keep dreaming. Keep imagining. In my imagining and exploring possibilities, I find it helpful to look to some wise sources. And for me, that includes sometimes diving and swimming around in something called theology. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move into this service, but I want to begin with sharing a reading from a postmodernist feminist theologian, Monica Coleman, who utilizes that label, and don't attach to the label. Just listen to the description. I'll talk more about that label and that particular point of view and framing in a few minutes. But for now, just listen. Not all evil in the world can be overcome. And yet, in a postmodernist feminist theology, maintains hope in the struggle to creatively and constructively respond to it. Sometimes feelings of discord are the result of conflicts in the world. Sometimes liberation is not possible, but survival and quality of life are. All-encompassing health, wholeness, unity, and salvation are never fully attained in the world. As we constantly are becoming, we are constantly vulnerable to evil. And we are constantly capable of overcoming it. In a postmodern womanist theology, salvation is an activity. Each new moment brings possibility in both directions, for good or for evil. A postmodern womanist theology strives for tangible representations of the good. The good includes justice, equality, discipleship, quality of life, acceptance, and inclusion. The good. Hard to see it sometimes. The fires are raging in Southern California. People describe it as biblical. Well, that's one side of the message that comes from Judeo-Christian Bible. Political firestorms are on the horizon in Washington, D.C. I view these unfolding stories with pain and trepidation and sorrow, and I seek a narrative, some example, perhaps some exemplars, to help me find the answers to the questions asked by the wizard in our story. Who or what do you want to be? Who or what do I want to be? As I get older, I sometimes rephrase that question as, what kind of ancestor do I want to be? What stories will be told about me? In addition to stories about fires and firestorms, the recent news offered us an exemplary version of what kind of person we might strive to be a little more like. The accounts of the life of the President Jimmy Carter, who for a century lived a life of integrity, service, and faith, seeing those as central to leading a good life. His is a story worth repeating and worth retelling and worth grasping as inspiration for us. I was certainly inspired when I had an opportunity to work for Habitat for Humanity. I went to Zambia, and the leader of our trip had been on one of those 1 week a year builds with Jimmy and Rosalind. inspired her, and she helped inspire me, passed on down. Next week, we will be lifting up, a week from Monday, another exemplary ancestor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His striving for a greater good has much in common with the theology of struggle expressed in today's reading. In addition to pondering the guidance those exemplars might offer, I've been doing a different kind of exploration of options as how I might shape and reshape my own life story, to do things differently than I had before. A guidebook I've been exploring, based on a reference to the book, a referral from a beloved retired, like me, a Unitarian Universalist colleague, is titled Rest is Resistance, a manifesto by Tricia Hersey. Now, I've been about resistance for a long time, Right on, brothers, sisters, right on, siblings, And the concept of rest is resistance gave me pause to go, Tricia Hersey, like Monica Coleman, is a postmodern womanist theologian. The Coleman reading was excerpt from the book. Now, before I explore Hershey's notions, though, of how her views are beginning to seep into my own continual unfolding story, I want to provide some theological context. As many of you know, I took a deep dive, and I wrote down a few years back, but it's become a number of years back, into theology when I sought a Master's of Divinity School at Meadville Lombard Theological School. Meadville Lombard Theological School. I got to admit, initially I went, theological school? Is that what I have to do if I want to become a Unitarian Universalist minister, to study theology? And the answer was yes. And in time, I actually got to enjoy theological deep diving. To help connect me to striving and growing I did there, I swore today a talisman. This stole was a graduation gift from my classmate cohort at Meadville Lombard. This symbol is the former, they've updated the logo. It was the symbol for Meadville Lombard Theological School. So it helps me feel a little bit more like a theologian when I can grab a hold of this one, right? The other side, we're pretty familiar with the chalice. Meadville Lombard is one of two Unitarian Universalist seminaries here in this country. The other is Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley. Meadville Lombard is in Chicago. At Meadville, we studied theology, and we explored things like postmodern feminist theology. Sometimes those explorations made my brain ache because I thought so hard and tried to grasp it. It was good for me, though, because I find some threads from that learning are woven into how I view the world and how I am in the world. Before I explore further the way such a theology and Hersey's work might offer inspiration and guidance for our own theological understandings and our lives, I feel the need to contextualize this exploration and define some terms. To do that, I want to begin with exploration of what postmodern womanist theology is, or at least offer up a white man's view of how I understand it and how it offers insights that shape my own theological understanding and how it shapes who and what I strive to be. So let's explore just a bit what that label postmodern womanist theology might mean. As a kind of disclaimer, These are my understandings, and some may define it differently, particularly since it is a theology that comes from a black woman's perspective. Okay, so this is a white man's interpretation of what I've heard those siblings say. The first term I want to define, though, is theology, which means literally, if we go back to the Greeks, the study of theos, or God, or divinity. I define it as the study of deep exploration, both externally and internally, of that which I find holy, however we might name that holy. Theology is not simply the study of God, as that label is used in a Judeo-Christian framework, but it's much broader and wider explorative process. Meanwhile, postmodern theology emerged late in the 20th century. One definition that makes sense to me is that it is a theology that asserts that our hope does not rest in the world beyond or in the world to come, but in the world here and now. Hope is in change, not in exchange. The focus is on transformation. The theology classes I took at Meadville Lombard include one in process theology, which explores an interactive process between humanity and divinity, and a humanist theology course that explored religious, human-centered expressions of a power or power that is greater than ourselves. Such a force has no need for a divine being or expressions of the supernatural. One form of humanist theology, which I embraced and still do because it explains some of my continually evolving worldviews, is the notion of religious naturalism, which as I summarize as being seeing the natural world as so super, so amazing, so awe-inspiring that I do not need to embrace anything supernatural to be filled with and sometimes overwhelmed by an all-encompassing sense of awe and reverence. It's out there. I also took a global theology course. That was the most mind-stretching. And it was there that I was introduced to liberation theologies, including womanist theologies. One text from the liberationist perspective that I remember from that class is one titled Longing for Running Water, Ecofeminism and Liberation by Yvonne Gabarra. That insightful exploration of meaning, written by a Brazilian Catholic nun, was my first deep dive into theologies that had emerged from those whose life experiences and worldview were vastly different from my own. When I discovered through it my own way of articulating Gabarra's notions, I was deeply moved. It was transformative. Such notions from those sources and others challenge the Eurocentric, white supremacist, and patriarchal notions that are often dominant in our culture. Notions which, without my knowing, had been embedded into my own thinking. Listening to these different voices offered lessons that resonated deeply within and shifted my sense of who and what I want to be. They helped me in my striving to be liberated from a culturally imposed, narrow, restrictive worldview. As some of you may know, liberation theology, especially the notion of an expression of one's deepest held beliefs through action, emerged in 20th century in Latin America from Catholic priests who affirmed, like Monica Coleman, that a meaningful theology framework is one that strives for tangible representation of the good, and that the good includes justice, equality, discipleship, quality of life, acceptance, and inclusion. When I review that womanist list of the good, I am struck by how similar it is to the values that we affirm, especially in the newly adopted expression of our values of Unitarian Universalist theologies that are now Article 2 of the bylaws of our association. It's the official expression of our most deeply held beliefs. And here's what we say about ourselves. We put love at the center, and we lift up justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity as our values. Unitarian Universalism, a non-creedal faith, emphasizes the importance of what we do, and it's being more important than simply giving voice to what we believe. In theological terms, this would be our orthopraxy. Thank you, Jackie, for heading me towards that direction and exploring that word more deeply. Orthopraxy, as opposed to orthodoxy, what we believe, okay? So it's how we live our life, orthopraxy, what Buddhists might call right action. Deed, not creed. Now, the very creedal Catholic priests who put liberation theology into action would agree with those of us UUs who affirm that true faith needs to be expressed not just as belief, as orthodoxy, but also through deed, through a theological frame that says that's how we manifest true faith, true belief, our deepest beliefs. To many Latin American Catholics, that meant standing up for the poor and oppressed. Even it meant being in conflict with governments and other secular power structures. The most dramatic example of this is the activism within the church that led to the brutal assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero by government-aligned force in El Salvador in 1980. Taking a stand, a theological liberationist stand for what is right. In the United States, liberation theologies influenced those who began to articulate Black liberationist theologies and womanist theologies and queer theologies. The particular form womanist theology emerged from Black women who, in their own lived experience, had lived with the reality of continuing marginalization, both because of their gender and their race. Though it is a theology arises from life experience that is very different from my own lived experience. As a privileged white man, I can and do learn powerful lessons from its stories, from their stories. And I'm inspired to strive for good and to be supportive where I can from my own identity of efforts to dismantle Eurocentric notions of white supremacy and patriarchy that have been justified and which I've sometimes been complicit in their impact on systems of oppression. In Hershey's book, which gave me a different perspective on resistance. Rest is resistance. She affirms that what she labels grind culture has oppressed all workers, but most dramatically Black women who have been delegated often by white supremacist patriarchy to the most servile of roles. She shares the lessons she has learned from her ancestors and her own lived experience, and her wisdom offers benefits for us all. To stand up against what she called grind culture. There's an old adage, very few of us invited to offer thoughts on our life experience if we're on our deathbed, would tell everybody, I only wish I had spent more time at the office. That's not what we aspire to do, yet grind culture celebrates lots of time at work. I have ministerial colleagues who are proud to proclaim, I work 60, 70 hours a week. Well, fortunately, another colleague shared with me a lesson they discussed in her ministerial doctoral program, saying sometimes that disempowers congregations. And where did we get this notion that work will make me a better human being and will achieve all that I hope to achieve. You know, I come to mind for me, I think about it. We are taught that if we work harder, we will get the greatest rewards. But even for those of us who are privileged to be well compensated for our work, it only gets us more stuff as we become more embedded in our consumer-driven capitalist system. For too many of us, I think about that song that I remember from my childhood. Work your fingers to the bone. What do you get? Bony fingers, right? It serves a system far better than it serves us. Now, though Hersey calls her work a nap ministry, she encourages a nap ministry, right? She calls herself the nap minister, you know, the minister of naps. If there were an archbishop, she might claim that title. That's because of the movie I watched last night. I'm thinking about archbishops. But Hersey encourages any array of ways of resting that include simply closing your eyes for a few minutes, a silent, little longer than necessary shower, meditation, maybe for 20 minutes a day, sipping a cup of warm tea, listening quietly to music that you find calming, not as background for your busyness, but simply listening. Perhaps taking time for an entire album. Taking a break from social media. This, she acknowledges, can be a kind of Sabbath. A meditative walk in nature, or playing a musical instrument. Laughing intensely. I'm glad that she describes that as restful, because it does. It just... Knitting, crocheting, or quilting. Praying. Or creating an altar of objects that are sacred to you. A long warm bath, to which I suggest one might add some bubbles. And a timed midday 20-minute actual nap. Or dance, alone or with someone else. I would add to her list non-specific puttering in the garden, not a task, but just puttering around out there, or simply watching the birds. Both of these two are quieting practices that I find most accessible within my admittedly all too busy days. Each morning, as we have breakfast, we have scores of birds who come to our feeders, and I enjoy just watching them flit around. Sometimes I count how many species. It's typically 10 to 12, but that's just to focus my brain a little bit as I watch those chickadees and towhees et al. And there are also the hawks and turkey buzzards that regularly circus above and all around the little valley at the edge of town where I'm blessed to live. I just watch them. Rest, Hersey reminds us, is the place where dreams and imagination emerge. Imagination, the writer Bell Hooks asserts, is one of the most powerful modes of resistance that exploited and oppressed folks can do and use. Imaginative notions of resistance shared by womanist writers, musicians, poets, and teachers can offer instructive examples for all of us. Listening to Black women's stories can aid all of us in our search for shared liberation. Black women whose ancestors have sustained themselves, have survived and thrived of systems of oppression that objectified them and their siblings for 400 years. 400 years here in America. I think they have much to offer for those of us who are just trying to figure out how we're going to get through the next 4. Let's look to theologies that have sustained oppressed people for centuries. Closing one's eyes does not mean taking your eyes off the prize. On the contrary, it opens the pathway to dreaming and imagining how we might sometimes arrive at the beloved community, somehow, someday. Let's imagine those possibilities. Back in August of 1963, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he was beginning to deliver his prepared speech when a wise black woman, Mahalia Jackson, called out to him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And he set down his prepared speech and he shared a dream that continues to resonate and has changed America. Hersey reminds us that we often cannot change the larger story on our own. She writes, "We cannot heal alone, and we must graft our rest practice in a collective way, with our North Star being disruption, refusal, and healing." And she tells stories of how her ancestors best did that in church. In church. A place to come together and be held and to share grief and to share sorrow and to imagine something different. To imagine a beloved community. The work must be done. She quotes Reverend King. Freedom is never voluntarily given. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Hershey agrees with Dr. King that the church, especially the black church which helped sustain our ancestors, was the place to begin a movement. That remains true here and now. So let's just take some time right now to rest, to pause, and to imagine. I encountered a fascinating story a week or so ago in the New York Times in the days following the election, where in a black church they did an altar call and they invited all the women to come forward. They do that in those churches with enthusiasm and a zest we find hard to get to sometimes. And an associate minister prayed with them. And the prayer was, "May you find peace. May you find Sabbath." Taking time to dream. Taking time to imagine, recognizing that a break in the struggle is the ability to continue within and beyond. So let's take another moment to just rest, to pause and breathe in and out together. In and out, letting go of that to-do list. And may we all establish that making such quiet moments an expanding part of our daily life is an act of resistance. Let go, my siblings, of the fictitious stories that tells you success is about doing more and more and more. Strive rather to be more and dream more and imagine more. And then go forward rested and renewed to step by step seek the beloved community. May it be so. Now, as is the tradition of this community, is a time when you can share with the beloved community some of the reflections that may be surfacing sooner rather than later. So, Kathy's got the mic if there's folks that want to share now.
So it sounds like we need to include besides right thinking, right action, also right inaction.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good way to phrase it, is that sense of right inaction. And that's one of the things that I get from Buddhist teachers. Not being reactive is a form of not being active, to simply sit with what is and ponder more deeply, what am I going to do? But I don't have to do it right now. And it's a challenge for me. I'm not good at it. I'm a doist. I'm an addicted doist. And so for me, it's unwinding. It's finding those times. Like to go outside and say, no, I'm not going to turn that bed over right now. I'm just going to let those leaves mulch down and compost some more, which actually in that kind of gardening situation is the better thing to do and a good example of inaction. Compost happens if I just leave it alone. Kathy?
Right rest.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing some of your learnings from theology school. I think that I, in all my years, have never heard a minister stand and share the specific names and learnings of their divinity school, and I loved every word of it.
Thank you. I think we somehow think, well, not everybody wants theology, but if I like it, I think you might too, right? And I know this guy does, right? Cesar, he's like ready for it. He's a deep diver. I know a little bit about him, but I know that part. So.
I am a champion napper. But I also worked in Portland for 20 years. 13 of those years was in a predominantly African American area. And after 13 years, it dawned on me how little I really understood and how it's quite difficult to understand a culture other than our own, no matter what it is. But the other thing that I don't know if you touched on was that I came to the conclusion of in what I knew to be this culture was the incredible strength of Black women. In the area where I lived, as I saw it, because I worked mostly with women, but I saw them as holding the community together. And I'm sincerely waiting for Stacey Abrams to be president of this United States.
So that's one of those imaginative notions of how it can be, and we need to look to those, and in the darkest times, we sometimes need to embrace those as the light. Cesar.
I was listening to a podcast from a therapist. He's an addiction therapist, and his patient said something that shocked him about the definition of hell. And this is in the context of changing your story / perspective. And he was saying the definition of hell is to have everything go your way. Because if everything went our way, we got the president we want, we got the spouse that we wanted to marry, we got perfect health, we forever looked 21, never aged, that is the definition of hell, because that means we would never grow. We wouldn't struggle. How do you get the perfect health? Well, you change your diet. How do you get the, people pass away from your life, then you grow from that experience. Life isn't always pleasant. You take in the good and the bad, and how do you work with those emotions? It's a complexity of being human. Without the complexity, we're two-dimensional characters. And we don't get name and recognition after death because we never struggled for anything. But that was just interesting.
No, thank you, Cesar. Susie's got something up here.
I would just say that I think that it's actually all women who really are the backbone probably of a lot of growth and good change all over the world. And I think the more strength that women come forward with, they have it. If we can just get it out there more, maybe we can make some changes that won't come with a patriarchal society.
Right, and I like to hope under the notion that, patriarchal white supremacist society's death row is like now. But I thought that in 2016 too. So we're not there yet. And, as I shared the last time was with you, I look to, and it's worth hearing again, Kamala Harris's concession speech where she talked about, if we strive, if we keep working at it, we'll win. She said, it's a lot longer timeline, and we need to do that framing as well, and recognize that life is a marathon, not a sprint, and so we need to pace ourselves, and even, marathoners, all but the most extreme out there, amazing superhuman beings, stop and take a water break and nurture themselves, so Connie.
Well, I love it when I come to this place and get to drive home and mull over things. So for me, what I'm going to be mulling over is the intention of quieting practices. So probably at least for the next week, I'll be thinking about that and mulling it over.
I sparked some interest with this particular chosen stories that I'm lifting up here.
Well, Dennis, I think that you got into my brain and covered everything just about that I've been thinking about for the past year, at least, maybe my whole life. Talking about change, wow. I grew up in the South. I was exposed to Southern thinking, and I accepted it. I accepted that black children had to drink from a different fountain, and when I asked my mother about it, I accepted her explanation that, well, they're not clean. I accepted it when I walked on the sidewalk and met a black person, and if the sidewalk wasn't wide enough, they stepped off. I didn't raise my eyebrows and wonder why then. I just accepted it. And I didn't start the change, and it wasn't a quick change, until Martin Luther King died. And I was married at that time to a man who was a true conservative and a Republican. And we were watching the news, and I said, he got what he deserved. My husband turned to me and he said, I am so ashamed of what you just said. And that hit me, that I had made a man I very much loved ashamed of me. And that started the process of me looking at myself and changing and wondering why the way I had grown up had affected me in such an ugly way. Thank you, Dennis, for your thoughts this morning.
Well, and thank you for your open-hearted sharing of, because the reality is the process of constructing a different future begins with deconstructing, taking apart some notions. I mean, when I first heard that phrase, white supremacist culture, I was like, who, me? And then I dug a little deeper and I went, yeah, me. Let's start with that, and, profound lessons that come through life. And, a lot of that for many of us with privileged backgrounds is owning our stuff. Lily.
I kind of aggressively signaled for this microphone because I feel so privileged, Carol, to follow you. So very privileged. What I've been thinking about through the entire sermon today, and loving to watch you and listen, is I was thinking about coming out. I was thinking about being a lesbian, and I was thinking about coming to a point of using that word. And I was thinking about imagination beyond the beyond of where I ever thought I could go, like getting married. And I was thinking about building community because we didn't have it. And I was thinking about connecting in love because we didn't have it. And I went all the way back to thinking about that first recognition that I might be different or I might be a lesbian, and looking at every single value that had been presented to me, or every single thing about who I should be and who I am and how it doesn't fit. And so there went a process that every single lesbian, gay person, queer person has to go through, because I've been told I'm very different from the beginning. And I realized that, originally we used to say 10% of this country were GL, and now if it's GLBT, we have to add it to probably 12, and if we want to add it to queer, it's probably 15%.
That's why people use a plus, right?
Right.
A wide range of ideas.
But of that 15%, how few of us ever get into a church? You've heard me talk about being unchurched until I walked in here. But then I remembered how we always created community. We always created church. And I remembered knowing Gemma. And I remembered us creating community together of this town of gay and lesbian people in 1979. Roseburg, 1979. And so I thank you for letting me take that journey and realize my whole life's been about imagination. But I was a little behind. I didn't think we'd be able to marry as soon as we were.
Sometimes it can be more than we imagine. I mean, the reality, which I've reflected sometimes, when we were surprised in 2016 that America wasn't ready to elect a woman president, I said then, well, why are we surprised it took till 2017 for the Unitarian Universalist Association to elect a woman president? Well, now, the Unitarian Universalist Association has elected an out lesbian black woman president of the association. So, power to the UU people. We've moved. But moving to that place took deconstructing work to move to that place where we are aspiring to be as our expression of beloved community. So thank you for hanging in there with this journey. And we do this journey together. You've seen me that old idiot. I've used that ditty here before. What's the church? It's the people, and people who suffered for, oppression for centuries survived because they had the support of church. So, hanging in there for this, which sometimes it is hanging in there, is so vital to each and every one of us and to what we are able to offer, to the larger world. So, amen. And let's have fun while we do it. And so I selected as a closing hymn one I know that's a favorite here. It's 311 for those who want to look in the hymnal. But the lyrics, if you don't remember them, will be projected. Let it be a dance.
We do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Let a dancing song be heard. Play the music, say the word, and fill the sky with sailing birds. Let it be a dance, let it be a dance, let it be a dance. Learn to follow, learn to lead. Feel the rhythm, feel the need. To reap the harvest, plant the seed. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Everybody turn and spin. Let your body learn to bend. And like a willow with the wind, let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. A child is born, the old must die. A time for joy, a time to cry. Take it as it passes by. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Morning star comes out at night. Without the dark there is no light. If nothing's wrong, then nothing's right. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let the sunshine, let it rain. Share the laughter, bear the pain. And round we go again. Let it be a dance.
I know the bump is sometimes my
Energy
favorite
providers
part.
don't.
Our closing words of benediction, Margaret William Braxton. Once upon a time, I was. Now I am. Someday I will become. Once there was, now there is. Soon there will be. And someday there surely shall be. Once upon a time we were, now we are. And someday, hallelujah, we surely shall become. Salam, shalom, amen, and blessed be. And as Larry extinguishes our chalice this morning, I invite you, as is the tradition of this community, to form a circle for the closing song, Go Lift It Out.
Journey,